Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 154, The Billycan Millionaire. James Tyson started off by providing a butchery service to prospectors on the Victorian goldfields. He went on to establish pastoral runs all the way from the north of Queensland to Victoria and became a very wealthy man. In 1898, he died without leaving a will, with an estate totalling about £2 million. Banjo Patterson even wrote a poem about him. James Tyson was the sixth child of 14, born to Isabella Marie Coulson and William Tyson. His father was born on the 12th of November 1781 in Helton, Cheshire, England. He married Isabella on the 12th of November 1805 at the All Saints Church, Newcastle upon Tyne, Northumberland, England, when he was 24 and Isabella 19. Isabella was born at Newcastle on Tyne on the 22nd of December 1786. On the 25th of May 1808, Isabella faced the West Riding Quarter Sessions held at Pontefract. And it says that Isabella Tyson, the wife of William Tyson, late of Wakefield in the West Riding of the County of York, labourer, on the 25th of March 1808, with force and arms at the parish of Wakefield, from one Joseph Heafield, and feloniously stole, took and carried away 23 yards of gingham, valued at 10p, and a leather purse valued at 2p that contained 3 shillings and a 6p. In 1983, Lady Fletcher, the wife of Sir Alan Fletcher, and she lectured in historical subjects, and she did a lecture on James Tyson. And she says that there's 2 versions to the criminal list in regards to Isabella Tyson. One was stealing yards of gingham, and the other one is a colourful story that is the family legend. So the family story is that in a village street in the year of famine, a child, tattered, dirty and starving, is crying for food. And Isabella pleads with the baker that passes by with bread on his tray to give some to the child. The baker refuses, and angrily Isabella snatches a 2-penny loaf from his tray and hands it to the child. That was the crime that was passed on to her, which was 7 years' transportation to Australia. She was transported to Sydney on the ship Indispensable that departed England in February 1809. And she travelled with her 19-month-old son, William Jr., that was aged 19 months, and her husband, William, was also allowed to go. William gave up his career as a grenadier in the Royal Cumberland Militia to come out with his wife to Sydney town. He was actually in the employ of one of the wealthier passengers on the Indispensable to justify his trip, and they arrived on the 19th of August 1809. They did have an older child, Margaret, who was 3, but she remained in England. More on her when covering their children. Isabella's description was 5 foot high, ruddy complexion, black hair, dark eyes that were inflamed. When they arrived, Isabella was assigned as a housekeeper to her husband, and they began farming at Balcombe Hills. In 1812, the family were given a land grant of 40 acres at Aids. In October 1814, William was appointed the first constable in Appin. And the 22nd of April 1815 says in the Sydney Gazette, Government and General Orders from the Civil Department, His Excellency the Governor, having some time since deemed it advisable to sanction the construction and establishment of public pounds in the districts of Appin and Bringelly, is now pleased to appoint William Tyson to pound keeper at Appin. However, a little over a year later, on the 3rd of August 18, there was another Government and General Order. Civil Department, William Tyson, pound keeper and constable in the district of Appin, having been convicted by a bench of magistrates assembled at Parramatta on the 31st of July of having demanded extravagant charges for cattle impounded by him, and having acted also in an unbecoming and disrespectful manner towards the magistrates before whom he was called to answer for his conduct as a pound keeper, he is, for such imposition and disrespect, dismissed from both the situations of pound keeper and constable in Appin. So after this event, the Tysons set themselves up at East Bargo as small farmers with their growing family. By 1819, they built a house, a barn, a steel mill, and had some maize and wheat, 9 pigs, and 14 acres under cultivation. Isabella received her ticket of leave on the 26th of May, 1825. However, William died on the 10th of January, 1827 at Campbelltown, New South Wales, aged only 45. It seems that Isabella continued to manage the farm. In the 1828 census, she's recorded as being 41, free by servitude, a Protestant widow living at East Bargo with 8 children, living on 110 acres with 21 acres cleared, 21 acres cultivated and 4 horned cattle. On the 11th of July 1829, Isabella married Thomas Clements at the St Peter's Church of England in Campbelltown. They were both residents of East Bargo, and Isabella knew Thomas Clements as he was assigned to work for her husband in previous years. She married him 2 years after William's death. The witnesses to their marriage were William and Anne Rickson, both residents of Aids, who featured in episode 85. Isabella and Thomas had a 10-acre property at Campbelltown with 20 head of cattle and a team of bullocks. Thomas was one of 200 convicts transported on the ship Surrey in January 1814. He was convicted at the Devon Assizes for a term of 14 years on the 7th of August 1813. He was found guilty of uttering a forged Bank of England note. Isabella and Thomas had 4 children, and Isabella died on the 2nd of October 1874 at East Bargo, aged 87. In the evening news, it announces her death, and it said that she was respected by a large circle of friends, and she was buried at St Peter's Anglican Church Cemetery in Campbelltown. Now on to James Tyson. He was born on the 8th of April 1819 at Cow Pastures. His first job was a farmhand for the Vine brothers near Appin. His wages as a farm labourer were £30 per year with keep. About 2.5 years after he commenced, he took with him £60 of his wages, of the £75. He spent a short time in Sydney in 1837, apprenticed as a bootmaker, and then he worked as an overseer for Henry O'Brien at Duro near Yass, working with cattle for 18 months, and he also worked at Henry O'Brien's properties at Hay and Griffith. As a youth, he also commenced work for neighbours such as Major Thomas Mitchell and John Buckland, and they later contracted him to take cattle to the north-eastern border area of the colony of Victoria. Once he moved on from Henry O'Brien's properties, he managed Barwidgee on the Ovens River for John Buckland. In 1842, James had a child with Neola, an Aboriginal woman from Yanga near Balranald, who'd been born in about 1820. This child was Jeremiah Kirby, otherwise known as Jerry or Charles. He was born on Toorong Station at Oxley in the Riverina of New South Wales. He married Clara Malfarmer Walters in 1876 at the property Tupra at Oxley in New South Wales when he was 34 and Clara was 16. Clara had been born on the property Juanbong at Oxley in the Riverina, both properties owned by James Tyson. Jerry died on the 2nd of December 1920 at Gum Point in New South Wales. And there was a small article outlining his death saying another of the few remaining Aboriginals died at Gum Point on Thursday night, Jerry Kirby, aged 76. With his brother William, James took up a holding on the Billabong Creek called Bundoola in 1845 and bought some cattle. Bad season sent them on the road in search of grazing for their stock. In their worry, they forgot to renew their squatting licence and someone else acquired it. The banks failed and they lost the nest egg that they so thriftily left for the future. And if that was not enough, the cattle found poisonous herbage and all but a few of them died. So at the age of 24, James Tyson was flat broke, ruined, and already felt like he was a failure. Legend has it that while James was away buying more cattle, his brother William sold the drought-stricken property for £12, which they never received. And this is where the story was born, that he only had 1 shilling, and he spent the shilling on a ferry to cross the flooded river at either Deniliquin or Gundagai, depending on who wrote the story, and he swam his cattle and himself across with his belongings on his head. The next year, him and William squatted on land at the junction of the Murrumbidgee and Lachlan rivers before it had been released for settlement. They acquired the lease for Toorong, initially known as Tyson's Run, on the west bank of the Lachlan, near its junction with the Murrumbidgee, and this holding became the centre of the Tupra Juanbung properties. They later leased Jeremy. By this time, younger brothers John and Peter had joined them. Gold was discovered in Bendigo late in 1851. Early in 1852, the Tyson brothers heard the news As quickly as they could, James and William mustered their marketable fat cattle and took it to the road by the most direct route. Bendigo was about 200 miles from their station, Jeremy, but this route meant crossing a plain devoid of natural water. The alternate route was longer, Balranald, then to Swan Hill and then on to Bendigo, and this was 230 miles, but it was well watered. They took the well-watered route, and James and William arrived at the Bendigo goldfields with a small mob of cattle. They set up a slaughter yard and a butcher's shop in the shade of willows in the bend of a creek on the northern side of the Bendigo goldfields. The cattle were hardly cool from the drive when William slaughtered the first of them, and James became a temporary auctioneer and sold the carcasses to the miners. As soon as the auction was completed, James left the butchering and the selling to William and headed back to the Riverina for more cattle. His method was to meet the weary herds on the last stages of their long journey from far-flung stations, offer the exhausted drovers a good price, which they eagerly accepted, and then after 10 days or so of slow grazing, that is, droving the cattle as slowly as he could possibly through other men's holdings, as there were no fences, fattening the cattle on other men's grasses, and he would arrive in Bendigo with his cattle in good condition. By this time, William had been joined by the two younger brothers to help with the butchery. When all the stock from the Lachlan was sold, the brothers went to Queensland and brought 60,000 sheep overland to Bendigo. In 1855, after 4 years in operation, while the goldfields were still prospering, the Tyson brothers decided it was prudent to sell the Bendigo operation before any decline in population and market took place. They were anxious to get top money. They sold the business to rival squatters James and Henry Ricketson. I covered Henry Ricketson in episode 77. They sold the business for £55,000. Some sources say £80,000. Exactly what it was sold for is not very clear, but we do know that William Tyson Jr., James's brother, remained in Bendigo with a substantial operation until 1860. So quite possibly, William took his share and continued his own business. With the money, James purchased his first property from the Royal Bank. This was one of Benjamin Boyd's properties, and Boyd had recently gone bankrupt. It was called the Deniliquin Run, which is now Mundywar, and this is just on the northern side of Deniliquin, and he purchased this in 1856. His brothers, John and Peter, bought South Deniliquin and Canargo Point, which is now called Quaimong, which they improved with fencing and they added earth tanks. The 3 properties in total cost them £19,810. James erected, at the woolshed part of the property, an earth tank, and this is where he built his fine brick mansion in order for it to have water supply. James made important experiments in digging channels for water. However, silt issues did not allow this to be a success in the Deniliquin area. James' interests in the town of Deniliquin included the Deniliquin and Moama Railway Line, the Deniliquin and Echuca Electric Telegraph Company, and the Riverina Separatist Movement. The Riverina Separatist Movement was where there was a group of residents in the Deniliquin and surrounding areas where they petitioned to the government to have the Riverina as its own state. Obviously, they were not successful. John and Peter sold Quaimong in 1858. In July 1860, the steamer Mulgawanki, captained by George Bain Johnson from episode 92, made its way up the Edward River to Deniliquin. It visited Upper Deniliquin, the property of James Tyson, and many ladies and gentlemen took a pleasure trip on the boat from the Deniliquin township. James Tyson had to cut a portion of his bridge to allow safe passage of the boat. The boat was also refuelled there. With his success on the Deniliquin Run, James gradually bought up and acquired runs and holdings and properties and stations in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. He wasn't an absentee landlord. He visited regularly and he improved each property with methods far ahead of his time, sparing no expense and effort to do it. He put his Riverina holdings up for sale in 1861 and moved his operations north to the Lachlan River. He purchased Hayfield Station at Gippsland at this time in Victoria as well. Moving into Queensland, he took up Felton Station in the Darling Downs area, and going west, he picked up Tinninburra Cattle Station that carried 20,000 head of cattle. This was the biggest station in Australia at the time, with the biggest shearing shed. He planned to have holdings running from Cape York right through to Gippsland, so he could capture any market. In 1866, he purchased a group of pastoral runs: Wiwaruka, Rotten Row, Gordon Sheet and Teckleman, all on the Warrego River, and its tributary Cutterburra Creek. His other stations included Bangate, Gundublui, Tupra and Muranawa in New South Wales, Glen Ormiston, Swanvale, Meteor Downs and Albina Downs, plus Babalura, Carnarvon, Tully, Wyobe, Felton and Mount Russell in Queensland. He employed many of his nieces and nephews as managers and housekeepers on his properties. In the 1860s, two properties, Glen Morstan at Boulia and Tinninburra at Cunnamulla, were the leaders in the harnessing of artesian bores, the lifeblood of the far west. Also, Felton at Canberra had the first hydraulic wool press on the Darling Downs, and on Mount Russell, the water retriculation system was 30 years ahead of its next rival. He was rapidly becoming a rich man, and hundreds of graziers received cash loans from James Tyson at an 8 to 10% interest rate, often without security, as he could see that there were farmers in real need and they were hard-working. Good causes found him most generous. A committee called for him for a donation towards the building of a church on the Darling Downs. Tyson asked the amount of the builder's estimate, and on being told it was £400, he wrote a cheque for the whole amount. A few weeks later, the committee called again, and it seemed the builder had forgotten to include the cost of a lightning conductor, and would Mr. Tyson care to pay for that too? No, James said, courteous as always, if God can't protect his own church from his own lightning, why should I? His brother John died at Deniliquin on the 3rd of June 1860, and he left his estate to James. In 1883, the Queensland government was considering a proposition from an Anglo-French company to build a railway from Charleville to the Gulf, in return for 100,000 acres of land. Tyson was firmly of the opinion that Queenslanders should own Queensland, so he offered the government the money through his friend the Premier, Sir Thomas McElwraith. The offer was not accepted, but some years later, when the Treasury was in financial straits, he bought government bonds to the value of the same amount, £250,000, paid by cheque, the largest private cheque it is said to be ever drawn in Australia. He'd come a long way since his initial savings from his first job. The government acknowledged his generous help by appointing him in June 1893 as a member of the Legislative Council, a life appointment which entitled him to the prefix Honourable. He was a Member of Parliament for 5 years, during which time he only made one speech, and that was in support of the Marsupials Destruction Act. Unfortunately, he was misreported on his speech, and being so shy, he was dismayed and offended, and he retired from the rostrum and made no more speeches. By 1898, James Tyson held 5,329,000 acres, including 350,000 acres freehold. Aside from the properties outlined earlier, he also held other runs as a mortgagee. He was uninterested in stud breeding. He bred and fattened stock for the metropolitan markets. At Tully, his nephews tried to grow sugar on his behalf as well as run cattle. Tyson also owned some land at Toowoomba, Hay, New South Wales, and in Brisbane, and he made 2 abortive visits to New Zealand to investigate the possibility of land investment. He opposed the Victorian border stock tax and campaigned actively for the land tenure reforms embodied in the Crown Land Act of 1884 in New South Wales and 1885 in Queensland. He was generous to a wide range of charities. He contributed £1,000 to the New South Wales Sudan contingent and variously to the building funds of the Women's College, University of Sydney and the Church of England at Leyburn. In the late 1800s, he made his home at Felton near Canberra. In a letter to Henry Daniels at Felton in 1898, shortly before he died, he said, "I am very lonely. I have never knowingly injured a man in my life, and I am over 70 years of age and haven't a friend in the world. I have any amount of relatives. When you get old, you feel like you would like someone to pay you some slight regard." He died as he lived, alone, refusing to see a doctor even to the very last. It was commonly accepted that Tyson had not made a will. He was quoted as saying that he did not care what happened to his money when he was dead, but the years that brought him wealth also brought him wisdom and responsibility, and he spoke widely of leaving a large sum to establish in Toowoomba a college of technical and agricultural education. James Tyson did not marry and died apparently of inflammation of the lungs on the 4th of December 1898. He was buried in the Toowoomba Cemetery, but his remains were moved to the family vault at St Peter's Church of England, Campbelltown. There is a tomb that he erected for his parents and other members of his family that he lies within. An inscription reads, "Here lies the Honorary James Tyson MLC, one of the most successful pioneers of Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland." Tyson travelled much about Australia, but he eventually made his principal home at Felton Station on the Darling Downs. At the time of his death, his estate was the largest in Australia to that time. His estate was sold off and it realised £2.36 million, and it was divided amongst his closest relatives. He was described as a tall, handsome man, 6'4" with a bushy beard, abnormally and pathologically shy and extremely frugal in his habits. He was said to have been slow of speech, but very astute and perceptive, and an avid reader who had a well-stocked library. He was a well-informed man who wrote with a flowing hand, and he must have been a financial wizard. All of the business of his complicated affairs was done by himself, all of the particulars and details kept in notebooks in his saddlebags. He was meticulously honest and was never faulted to do the wrong thing in a deal. He travelled between his stations on horseback and later in a buggy. He spoke of Aborigines, saying that he liked the blacks, that they were gentle people, and if you treat them right, they treat you right. His chronic shyness caused him to camp out, even within sight of a township or a homestead where he would have been most welcome. Because of his shyness, he struggled to remember the names of the people he initially met, and he addressed everyone to whom he spoke to as Mr., not women, of course. He would not speak to women at all if he could avoid it. He habitually dressed like a tradesman or a boundary rider, and when he visited his various properties, he did so anonymously, preferring the swagman's camp and the company of sundowners to the comfort of the manager's homestead. He only ever did one interview for the Queenslander in January 1894, and he was asked why he went under the pseudonym of Smith. He replied, "Because I don't want anyone to know my business, where I am, where I'm going to, or where I came from. The manager of the station I'm going to look at now does not know I'm coming. When I leave there, he will not know where I'm going to or at what time to expect me again. Thus, I go through life quietly, never making a ripple on the surface." His frugality was shown when he visited the city, which wasn't often if he could help it. He only went to the city for business. He travelled second class, and he said that he only travelled second class because there was no third class, and he stayed at the cheapest motels. In those establishing years, he was known to swim the river to save the shilling toll fee, carrying his matches and chequebook under his hat or in his mouth, and arriving on the other side, he would light a fire to dry out. On one such occasion, he then rode on his way and later in the day bought a property for £30,000, writing a cheque for the whole amount on the spot. In later years, sitting around a campfire, he was asked, "And how, sir, did you make your money?" As he spoke, the man struck a match and lit his pipe. "Well," said Tyson, calmly and courteously, "there's only one thing I didn't do, I'll tell you that. I never used a match when a fire stick would do." He often said money, muscle and brains were made for use, not abuse. Money poured down a man's throat or wasted in useless luxuries might just as well as be thrown in the sea. He boasted he'd never been in a prison or a hospital in his life. He'd never been in a theatre or a church except to be christened. He never visited a doctor or tasted medicine. He never used bad language or tolerated it in others, and he never smoked or drank. It wasn't the money that drove him, but the challenge of opening up areas for farming through finding water. He was quoted as saying, "I have been fighting the desert all my life and I have won. I have put water where there is no water and beef where there was no beef. I've put fences where there were no fences and roads where there were no roads. Nothing can undo what I have done, and thousands will be happier for it after I am long dead and forgotten." There's a charming story of his mother being presented to the Duke of Edinburgh, the son of Queen Victoria, on his visit to the colony in 1872. Far from being overwhelmed by the honour, she said to him, "Now you may go away home to your good mother and tell her that you have shaked the hand of James Tyson's mother." In a rare expansive moment, he confided to a friend a little story. Out in the bush with cattle, he found himself in a strange country at night, cold and hungry and lost. Seeing a light among the trees, he went to the house to ask the way. The door was opened by the finest woman he ever laid eyes on, tall, clear-eyed and rosy of cheek. With kindness and concern, she insisted that he come in and sit by the fire while she prepared him a meal. The sight of this charming girl bustling around the cosy room made a profound impression on him, but he was too shy to let her know, and he lacked the courage to return and thank her. From time to time he asked after her, and at last was told she'd married. So that was the end of his love story and the closest he ever came to one. James had many nicknames. Daylight Jimmy, from his lifelong habit of early to bed, early to rise. Billycan Millionaire, from his preference for tea made and served in a smoke-blackened billy. Mean Tyson and Hungry Tyson, which were quotes quite often from the media. He was quoted as saying, "I am happiest under the stars of heaven, with a bluey for my pillow and a billy of tea by my side." His death was reported across Australia, but also in London and New York. In the Melbourne Leader, it reported his death on the 10th of December 1898, an Australian millionaire. Australia does not produce many millionaires, so the death of one, and the most considerable of the lot, is a fair subject for passing comment. In many respects, the late James Tyson was a remarkable man. He acquired his fortune by the unusual method of steady and persistent industry. The peculiarity about the Tyson career was that he owed little of his success in accumulation of wealth. His millions were the result of a devoted attention to business, and he was the architect of his own fortune. Mr. Tyson started from very small beginnings and with few worldly advantages. His strength lay in his character, in his unwearying industry, and in his determination of thrift, and in his power of concentration. He gained some knowledge of cattle on his father's farm, which afterwards was turned to profitable account. When he started for himself, he commenced as a work overseer on a farm. There is a story that his estimated fortune of £5 million had its foundation in one lame cow which somebody gave him. This was the beginning of vast herds which afterwards raised him into the position of the cattle king of Australia. A more voracious basis may be discovered in his wonderful capacity for thrift. On his own admission, when he was working hard for 10 shillings a week, he found it possible to save money. The quality of saving would not furnish sufficient explanation unless coupled with a keen business instinct, quick to appreciate the opportunities which the conditions of the country half a century ago offered the energetic and industrious man. He was barely 23 when he entered into pastoral occupation on the Lachlan, and when the golden era of Victoria commenced, he was in a position to make money, not by mining, but in the much more certain and profitable business of feeding those who were under the influence of gold mania. This was the beginning of his great fortune. No one, not even himself, knew the exact extent of his belongings. He was above all else a pastoralist, the owner of countless millions of sheep and innumerable herds of cattle. When questioned in the witness box as to the number of stations he owned, he confessed that he was unable to answer. He held pastoral properties in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, but being of pioneering blood, as settlement increased, he pushed out his investing properties further back, until his interests were most largely represented in the Riverina in Queensland. Probably he was a richer man a few years ago than when he died, for drought and unfavourable seasons must have played havoc with his concerns. Mr. Tyson was a man of peculiar temperament. Not of ungenerous disposition, he was so innately thrifty that he achieved a reputation for meanness not altogether deserved. Many of the stories told of the trait of the character, earning him the nickname Hungry Tyson. He abhorred waste and applied the doctrine with equal severity to himself as to others. Without one redeeming vice which has been held to be essential to appreciation in the public mind, he displayed qualities so foreign to the stereotyped conception of the millionaire that he was regarded generally as an enigma. Yet, if not an attractive personality, he rendered far more useful service than the generality in his class. And in a Queensland newspaper, it says, Mr. James Tyson, commonly known as Jimmy Tyson in Queensland, was a prominent figure in the history of Queensland, owing to his being such a powerful factor in the development of its resources. He owned mostly pastoral lands on the Darling Downs and Warrego River, but he also acquired considerable blocks of sugar country on the Johnston River. Outwardly, he displayed little interest in public affairs, and therefore the people of the colony were profoundly astonished some years ago at the publication of an offer from him to lend the colony $500,000 for the Transcontinental Railway to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Mr. Tyson was naturally kind-hearted and generous. For many years, he made Felton Station on the Darling Downs his principal address, where he lived a quiet, healthy life. For some time he'd been in a low state of health. Though ailing, he persistently refused any medical aid, and on Monday evening was found dead in his bed, apparently passing over quietly during the night. Mr. Tyson was a bachelor, a teetotaler and a non-smoker, and rose at 4 a.m. every day. The manager, Buchanan, discovered his body, and he informed his staff of the passing of the old gentleman, as his staff called him, and he also sent a message to Brisbane. It was sent to Mr. Macdonald Patterson, James Tyson's solicitor, and Mr. Macdonald Patterson promptly chartered a special train and came to Felton immediately. He came to take possession of the will that he said he himself had drawn up during Tyson's visit to him only days previously, in which the old gentleman signed it and had brought it home for further perusal. However, no will was to be found, and as a result James Tyson was declared intestate. There was a bit of legal squabbling over the death duties, as Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland all vied for the proceeds of the death duties. However, it was finally regarded that Felton was his home and that he'd lived there the longest, so Queensland won the argument. His fortune, even at this time of the Depression, was valued at £2.5 million, and it was divided amongst his many relatives and even descendants of his oldest sibling, Margaret, the sister that was left behind in England. They endeavoured to search for those descendants. Being interstate, all of the relatives had to put in a claim, and in the end, there were 31 persons who claimed that they were next of kin and they were entitled to share the estate. And of the 31, one is a sister of the deceased, and the remaining 30 are the sons and daughters of his deceased brothers and sisters. So in other words, a vast majority of his money went to his nieces and nephews. I'm going to go through the full list of the next of kin, and the reason why I'm doing that is that the second part of the episode is going through his siblings and their children and what became of them. These are the surviving relatives that are entitled to the share of the estate. The children of the late William Tyson, brother of James, James Tyson Jr. of Hay, grazier, Mary Scanlon of Bendigo, widow, and Peter Tyson of Corong Hay, grazier. The children of his younger brother Peter Tyson, Albert P.E. Tyson of Yea, grazier, Walter Tyson of Evansy Station, Hay, grazier, Alice Tyson, spinster of Evansy Station in Hay, Arthur C.D. Tyson of Yea, grazier, Emily Woods of Fitzroy, married woman, and Susan Matthews of Beaumont, Yea, married woman. His sister Barbara Herring's children, Susan Tyson of Hay, widow, Eliza Hill Hay, married woman, Barbara Zlymack of Tupra Hay, married woman. The children of his sister Elizabeth Hewitt, Annie Wanson of Wilton, New South Wales, married woman, Edward Hewitt of Meteor Down Station in Springshaw, Queensland, grazier, Stephen Howard of Appin, New South Wales, farmer, Elizabeth MacDonald of Tinninburra Station, Cunnamulla, Queensland, married woman, Barbara Henry of Tully River, Queensland, married woman, Emily Mulholland of Brisbane, married woman, Isabella Lewis of Wilton, married woman, Wilton Howard of Wilton, farmer, Peter C. Hewitt of Cordeaux near Picton in New South Wales, farmer, and Ellen Wanson of Wilton, married woman. The only sibling that James had at the time of his death that was still alive was Frances, so Frances Shield of Malden near Picton. The children of his other sister, Mary Moore, were Isabella Dwyer of Piddington, married woman, Elizabeth Eagles of Bulli, married woman, William Moore of Bulli, no occupation, and Alice Fay of Brooks Point, Appin, married woman. The children of Maria Horton, who was known as Maria Jones after her second marriage, Mary J.B. Soden of St Kilda, widow, and Emma M. Forbes of Perth, married woman. The children of Isabella Donnelly, another sister, John Tyson Donnelly of Camden Park, Toowoomba, Queensland, grazier, Annie Shield of Round Hill, Malden near Picton, New South Wales, widow. And in the Warrigal Garden in Victoria on the 22nd of September 1899, it says the Tyson millions, the next of kin, interesting particulars. It says, in the first place, it may be taken as settled that in accordance with decisions, that no claim will be entertained except from the lineal descendants of the interstate's parents. So basically it's saying that with James's parents being deceased, that it won't be traced backwards beyond that. However, because Isabella married to Thomas Clements and had children with him, it did state that those children, so James's half-brothers and sisters, could also claim. So it says, by both husbands, Isabella bore children, so at the outset there are two family branches to trace down, the Tysons and his half-siblings, the Clemenses. It also stated that most of the brothers and sisters had passed away, so it's upon their descendants that the interest of the investigation centres. Of the eldest sister Margaret and her descendants, there's little information, if any. The eldest brother William left 6 children. The second eldest sister, Isabella, married George Donnelly, and there were no less than 12 children of this union. And it listed members of the Donnelly family, but it said that some had died without issue and also some had not been accounted for. James Tyson's second eldest brother, Charles, died at 21 years unmarried. The next sister, Mary Ann, was married to Patrick Moore, and she had 4 sons and 6 daughters. Elizabeth Tyson, the fourth sister, was married to Edward Hewitt. They had 4 sons and 4 daughters. And it states that James Tyson was 7th in his family, and then came his sister Barbara, who married William Herring. There were 8 daughters of that marriage. The next brother, John, died at the age of 36 years unmarried, and the youngest brother, Peter, married Margaret Sheila, and they had 10 children. We have now traced as far back as our information goes the descendants of the Millionaire's full brothers and sisters, but others still remain to be considered due to the 3 children born to Isabella and Thomas Clements. It says the only members of that same generation are his half-brother Thomas Clements, who died at 53 unmarried, and the youngest half-sister, Frances Clements, who was married to James Shield in 1833. And at the point of the publication, they weren't aware if they had any descendants. As I mentioned at the outset of the episode, Banjo Patterson wrote an obituary poem in the fashion of the day, and it forms a fitting finish to the story of James Tyson as a truly remarkable Australian. Here is an opening verse. It's titled Tyson. Across the Queensland border line, the mobs of cattle go. They travel down in sun and shine on dusty stage and slow. The drivers riding slowly on to let the cattle spread will say here's one old landmark gone, for old man Tyson's dead. And another 2 verses outlined James's desire for anonymity and to lead a simple life. There stands a little country town beyond the border line where dusty roads go up and down and banks with pubs combine. A stranger came to cash a cheque. Few were the words he said. A handkerchief about his neck and an old hat on his head. A long grey stranger, eagle-eyed, said, "Know me? Of course you do." "It's not my work," the boss replied, "to know such tramps as you." "Well, look here, mister, don't be flash," replied the stranger then. "I never care to make a splash. I'm simple, but I've got the cash. I'm Tyson." Breaker Morant and Will Ogilvie also wrote about him, and in 2010, James Tyson was inducted into the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame as Australia's first cattle king. A digital story was produced to mark the occasion, where a descendant, Tyson Donnelly, talked about the life of James Tyson and his pastoral interests. Donnelly then read the Banjo Patterson poem. And the accumulation of wealth during his lifetime is estimated to be, in current terms, $9 billion. So he was indeed a very rich man. Tune into the episode that covers James Tyson's siblings. It's very interesting to see how well they fared in their own occupations. Quite a few of them ended up being quite wealthy landowners, just like their brother.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.